of New York Times correspondents to discuss this. Some of you may know that I'm a contributing writer for the Times and spent 22 years as a reporter for the paper before joining the faculty here. This conversation is co-sponsored by our Journalism Institute's Diversity and Inclusion Initiative and the Coalition of Minority Journalists, but I have to say, it feels a little bit like a family reunion to me, which is awesome. So who have we got here today? Ested Herndon and Jenny Medina are both political correspondents who are covering the 2020 campaign right now. Ested is also an analyst for CNN, covered California as a national correspondent, covering all kinds of issues, including education and immigration before joining the national political team. Caitlin Dickerson, John Eligo, and Sabrina Tavernisi all cover issues that inevitably overlap with politics. Caitlin covers immigration, John writes about race, and Sabrina focuses on demographics. The invitation that brought you here tells you a little more about all of them, and you can check out the New York Times website to read even more because these are some super accomplished folks. And so on behalf of Steve Solomon, our Institute's director, and Yvonne Laddie, who chairs our Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, welcome, welcome, welcome. And here's how this is going to go. We're going to discuss the issues as a panel for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions because we definitely want to hear what's on your mind right now. Now, you'll see Q&A button right at the bottom of your screen. And please use that when you're submitting your questions. I know that we all are using Zoom so much and our default is to go to chat, but don't do that. Please use the Q&A button. They'll go right to our committee chair, Yvonne Laddie, who will have them ready so we can jump to them when we're moving on to take your questions. And also, we'll be recording this conversation so then that we can share it. All right, so to get things started, I have a broad question for all of you that I'm hoping you can each take a stab at. We are only 1 week out, as you know, and I'm just wondering, in your minds, what is the issue or the issues in terms of race, ethnicity, and immigration that you think are likely to have an impact on the outcome of the election next week? And start with our political correspondents, Ested and Jenny. Ested?
Thank you for having me. I am excited for this, and I would say, to answer the question, to take a kind of broad view, I mean, I think that there is no issue in which these issues don't intersect on that we're thinking about when we talk about voters and what folks are thinking about. But I would actually just go counterintuitively and say we have a president that is running kind of explicitly on a white grievance campaign, right? And I think that question of America as a multiracial society, about whiteness and kind of what that means to the foundations of this country, is actually like a huge question that's on top of minds for a lot of people. I mean, you have the language. I mean, I was at a Trump rally today in Lansing, Michigan, and the language coming there is about this as a referendum on whose country it is. And I think that when you talk about that bleeds into immigration, right? That bleeds in to the protests we saw over the summer. But at its core, you're having folks kind of explicitly articulate that they see a rising tide of multiculturalism, of racial diversity that is thought of as zero sum in terms of power in this country. And so I think that you have a president and a Republican apparatus that has built itself on driving that grievance, whether it's through statues or through law and order or whatever they want to call it. The root of that is that, that Democrats and the constituencies that are powering them are ones to be afraid of. And I think that is going to be kind of what we see. I think back in 2016 when, the analysis after was that some of this was a white lash on a Barack Obama presidency. I think that it's going to be a referendum on what that looked like and what those last 4 years of having a president who has embodied that, right? That's something he's actually delivered on. When we think about kind of the ways that Trump's record has been, he has been the president culturally that he has promised to be. And so I think that referendum on whiteness and on the president that embodies that will be on top of mind for a lot of voters next week, and as many who have already voted.
Yeah, How about you, Jenny? What do you think of
Yeah,
this issue?
I would echo everything Estelle said and just add that it's sort of the question of what America you believe in and what America you live in, and do you want. I think one big difference is people who feel hopeful versus really pessimistic. The people who feel hopeful about this country, who think that it's going in a direction they want to see, are much more likely to vote for the president. They think, oh, things are going to be fine. But there are so many people who, because of the pandemic and because of so many other circumstances, really feel like they've been left out of the America that this president has portrayed, as Estelle was talking about. They want out and they want to see change, or they want to see some version of what they think normal is. And I think all of those things have to do with race and identity and how people see themselves. I've focused a lot on Latinos in this election, and there are a significant number of Latinos who are going to back the president, who are going to vote for the president. And the big difference between them and those who are backing Biden is whether or not they see themselves as part of some sort of collective. Like, do they identify with the people who the president's demonized? If they do, they're much more likely to vote for Biden. And if they don't, they're much more likely to vote for the president.
Okay. Caitlin.
I agree with everything that Estelle and Jenny have said. And I think that bringing up the pandemic is interesting and important because it's exacerbated all the divides that were so prominently discussed in 2016 when it comes to immigration specifically. But also, I think we were talking about race generally back then. I think both the pandemic and the racial justice protests and the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and unfortunately many others in the last few months sort of just draw that white lash, if that is what led to Trump being elected for his first term, draw it into stark relief, make it feel more exacerbated, make it feel even more top of mind for people. And, historically, the group that has been most likely to cast their vote based on their views on immigration, which is the topic that I specialize in, are conservative Republicans, the more conservative sort of wing of people who identify as Republicans. And so what I'll be interested to see is, right, just like Estelle said, Donald Trump really delivered on his promises during the first term when it came to immigration specifically. And I'm sure you all remember that there was a lot of discussion when he was running the first time around about whether he was really going to do the things that he was talking about doing, like sealing the border, like building the wall. So take the wall off the table because that didn't happen. But generally speaking, I think the most hardliners when it comes to immigration would be pretty satisfied with the president's first term. And those people who the first time around said, well, I support him for, these other reasons, I support him because of his economic policies, and I don't really think he's going to do what he's saying he's going to do on immigration. Now they know that he is. And so it'll be interesting to see if that traditional dynamic changes and it's not just conservative Republicans who are thinking of immigration as one of the primary issues that impacts their vote, but if more moderate conservatives are moved to vote based on it. And of course, I think the bigger question for me is whether liberals become more moved to vote based on their views on immigration.
John.
I think that for me, when I look at the issue of race and how it plays into this election, I think, I'm looking at it I want to see the prism through which Americans take the question of race in 2020 to the ballot box. And so by that, I mean, obviously we had, the largest protest movement in American history this year that, kind of sparked by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And the question is it's become something of a Rorschach, right? So for people who are activists, against police brutality and things like that, they are looking at this moment as this is a moment where we must address systemic racism in policing, but in all facets of society. So that is, driving and motivating a lot of people. But then there are people, and this is what, Trump has tried very hard, and other Republicans have tried very hard to do, is to make it not about, racial injustice or systemic racism, but make it about rioting and disorder in our streets. That's kind of the narrative through which they framed it. And I think about two people I spoke to in Henderson County, North Carolina, just like last week. One of them was a white city council member in one of the towns out there. And she said, while she believed that there is, and it's a predominantly white and conservative area out there in Henderson County. And she talked about talking with some of her neighbors about issues of race and racial justice, talking about some of her Black neighbors. And she really felt that there was this sense of, hey, things are good here, and we don't have all the same problems here in Henderson that they have elsewhere. But and what she draws out of this year of protests, she says she recalled that nearby in Asheville, that there was some rioting and some unrest over the summer during these protests, and she does worry about that, and that makes her worry about safety and a candidate who wants to support what she sees as safety, right? And so she supported Trump 4 years ago and is likely going to support him again. And in that same county, I talked to the head of the NAACP, which is a Black woman in her, I think she was in her 70s. Her first vote ever cast was for John F. Kennedy, and in a presidential election. And she talked about, she cannot remember a time where she felt more fearful or more frightened as a Black person since casting that first vote for John F. Kennedy back in the civil rights era. So it really, the stakes really come down to how you're going to view and how you're going to look at like what happened during this historic protest movement that we had this year.
Okay, Sabrina.
Hi. My colleagues are completely right. I think that, essentially, I guess the one thing I would add is after the 2016 election, I spent a fair amount of time with non-college kind of working class white people. And the thing that kind of surprised me, and I think that this is sort of enduringly true and still will be true, whether Trump loses this election or not, is that there is a substantial part of, or I don't know what size part, but certainly a part of kind of the emotion and what was going on was this like real pent up kind of fury on the part of lower status whites at higher status whites. And I guess I need to sort of I'm going to give a quick example of a fellow that I spent some time with. I think it was about a story about fake news, but the 2016 story about fake news. But he's just sort of this aging rocker guy, but he was in suburban Minneapolis, had built a pretty successful metal finishing business, didn't graduate from college, kind of like Trump, but had been kind of shocked at just how furious people in his social circle were at him for, bringing up the fact that he liked Trump. So, he said he said it in a bar and people were like, you're such a moron. How could you stupid could you be? You're so stupid. And he had this line that kind of stuck with me, which was, Sabrina, you people, meaning high status whites, college grad types, you think that you are the only round earthers, that we are all flat earthers out here, and that you, and basically you're just telling us, look, when we have time and patience, someday we'll teach you that the earth is round, but for now, just go sit in the back. We got this, we can handle it. And so I say that by way of illustration of just how, I totally agree with Ested. I think that fundamentally what is happening in America right now is a fundamental reordering of status. And it is, that is causing a lot of anxiety, and that is anxiety that the president, every day kind of stirs the pot on. That is how he makes his politics. But it's still there, whether or not the president keeps doing that. It's up, who we can only guess where the political and cultural divide will be without Trump. Clearly could be potentially different, but I do think that this is something that has been going on in society. That's like, I think, part of the equation that we sometimes forget. We think, we're constantly asking them, do you still like Trump? What do you think about Trump? Trump. Trump, is Trump good? Trump bad? It's like, are you done with Trump yet? And, there's sort of another part of the equation, which is kind of Democrats and liberals and how they are out in the world. And obviously Trump obfuscates about them as well. But I do think that there are two parts of the equation. Trump plus them equals the answer, not just Trump. So, yeah.
And Sabrina, because you've done a lot of reporting, obviously, on white Trump supporters back in 2016, I've been following some of the trends since then. Where are we now? Like, how solid is his base, do you think, now among white voters who propelled him to victory then? And what about suburban voters? Because there is a lot of talk about defections now.
So, gosh, there's so many parts to that question. If you talk about the Trump base and the sort of, super Trumpers, not people who voted for Trump, but people who really, really support Trump, those people, I don't think, and I think probably my colleagues know this better than I do, I don't think that they are not that different. And in fact, there was a lot of, I myself did a piece about Obama Trump voters, people who voted for Obama at least once and then voted for Trump in 2016. And there's been a bunch of polling on those folks over the past couple of years. John Sides, the guy who did Identity Crisis, and they have found, in January, they found that 78% of people in the Obama-Trump camp approved of the job the president was doing. So that sort of tells you that, those folks are probably never going to be Democratic voters again, or at least, in the near term. So I think that the hardcore base, I think, hasn't changed. I've definitely, and my colleagues in the politics team have done this much more than I have. There has been, I think there has been some change among younger white conservatives who are not conservative on race. I spent a bunch of time in Richmond, Virginia this summer, and spent some time in mainline conservative churches where the young people were just furious with the older people about not coming along with them on the Floyd stuff, which was pretty interesting. I was having a long conversation with one of them last week, and he said, my head is still kind of scrambled on all the race stuff, but the 100% thing I can tell you, Sabrina, is that I am no longer a Republican. So I do think that, Trump has changed the party in that way and kind of alienated those largely, suburban, almost entirely college educated voters away from the Republican Party.
Seb, anything to add there in terms of like the shifting support among white voters, if that is indeed happening?
Yeah, I think that we sometimes think of this as going to be the first referendum on whether suburban whites are sticking with Trump, but we've had them over the last 3 years, and we know kind of clearly from the midterms and from races that have happened in between that there is an erosion that he has had among that community. And so certainly it is not a full-on retreat. And I think that sometimes, I think we should be clear, Republicans, people who identify as kind of partisan Republicans, obviously overwhelmingly white, approve of what the Republican president has done by and large, right? The question, I think, is those kind of late breaking voters that came to Trump at the end of the 2016 election, right? The kind of classic person who didn't like Hillary Clinton and also didn't like Trump, who identified with his calling her corrupt and the like, who kind of broke in those swing states at the end. And then most importantly, the Democrats who stayed home, period. I think those are two huge communities that are going to look differently come this year. We know that there's less interest in third parties. We know that there's less undecided voters. And we know that in these swing districts, the reason why you had a 40 seat turn in the House is because a lot of those suburban people have broken with the president. And so, yeah, the coalition that we talk about that could come out from Joe Biden, I think it's important to note the differences between what we think about as Democratic coalitions. This might look wider than 2008 and 2012. This might be older than 2008 and 2012. And that includes coronavirus, that includes these racial concerns and the like, but it is a different looking coalition of Democrats that are happening because of all of these changes we're talking about. So I think some of us have to, I think in kind of punditry at large, there's this thought that the Obama playbook was the way the Democrats were going to win the White House. And that was going to be the only kind of coalition possible for them. Joe Biden doesn't do Obama level well on young people. He doesn't do Obama level well on people of color. He has made that up with older white people and with suburban white people.
That's really interesting. And talking about like kind of some of the complexities among communities of color, right? Some people assume, right, that Latino and Black voters are largely out of reach for Republicans, with some exceptions, but the truth is that it's more complicated than that. And Jenny, you were talking a little bit about Latino voters, and I think about 30% of the vote, Latino vote, went to Trump in 2016, despite his attacks on immigration. How is that looking now?
It's mostly the same. I want to back up for just 1 second and underscore a point that Sabrina and Estelle both made. I think one thing that's important to remember is that even no matter what happens next Tuesday or next Thursday or whatever the day is that the election's resolved,
Yes.
all these divides are still really going to be there. Like there are still going to be people who have these grievances, white grievances. There are still going to be these really major philosophical, ideological divides in this country. We haven't even gotten to conspiracy theories. Those I think are really much more powerful than we all realize. And the other big divide is gender. We have never seen polling that has such a big gap in terms of gender. Women are flocking to Biden much more than men are. And that gets to the Latino question and also with Black voters as well. You see that Latina women and Black women are overwhelmingly supporting Biden. And that is not as true, particularly among Latino men, particularly among American-born Latino men. And it is true not just in Florida, where there have been Cuban Republicans for many, many generations. This is true in Arizona. It's true in Texas. It's true in New Mexico, which is a pretty heavily Democratic state. There are a huge number, I think it is counterintuitive. I think most people think, a lot of people think, oh, Latinos are going to vote like Black voters, 90% Democratic. The number has been roughly 25 to 30% voting for Republicans since about Nixon until now. And Trump was the person that people thought would change that. And it just has not played out that way. When I started covering politics a couple of years ago, I remember a lot of Democratic pollsters telling me that 30% number from 2016 was wrong and that it was inflated. And I've gone back to them now recently and said, like, what happened? You told me that was inflated. Why are we seeing it again and again? And I just think it's just so counterintuitive. Part of it, and we can talk about this more, but part of it is that not all Latinos rank immigration as the thing they care about the most. In fact, most do not.
Right. And you also mentioned too, and I think you were talking about this a little bit just at the beginning, that kind of your worldview about kind of how you view your own identity as a Latino sometimes shapes those kinds of decisions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's been some really interesting research and polling, and I've seen this from my own reporting. A lot of it has to do with how you identify yourself. And there are many people who might be identified by demographers or by others as Latino who don't use that term. Either they use the term Hispanic or they use the term, they say, I'm American first. People who believe in the sort of notion of rugged individualism, like this sort of up by your bootstraps mentality, those Latinos, those Hispanic voters are much, much more likely to vote Republican. And it is, and they exist really strongly. On the other hand, people who identify as sort of part of this collective identity, who see themselves, who might use the term people, who will use the term people of color to identify themselves, who see themselves as sort of a broad pan-racial and pan-national Latino identity, are much more likely to vote Democratic and consider themselves liberals.
Okay. And John, like similarly, you've spent a lot of time with activists around the country, covering the protests, looking at how this enormous groundswell that we saw might translate into votes on the ground. Biden won the nomination, of course, in large part because of strong support among Black voters. Yet we saw Trump, at the debate, right, hammering away at Biden, acting as if there were perhaps votes to be won. Tell us a little bit about what you saw in Kenosha and why that might be true, that he thinks there might be some votes there.
Yeah, so after Jacob Blake was shot in Kenosha, he was the Black man who was trying to go into his car, and the police shot him in the back several times, and he survived. I was speaking to some Black voters there, particularly Black men, about the election and turnout and whether they plan to turn out to vote. And part of the reason is because in Wisconsin in 2016, Black turnout dropped something like 20%. It's a large number. I might be a little bit off there, but like it dropped a huge amount there. And, getting a sense, you go to these rallies, you go to, rallies held by Jacob Blake's family members, you go to, rallies with, elected officials, Mandela Barnes, the lieutenant governor in Wisconsin, and every rally starts and ends with get out and vote, like we got to do something about this. And you see that as well throughout the, across the country when it comes to some of these activist organizations. The Movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition, a collective of many different activist organizations. I'm on their email list and they are just pushing lots of things hard. They've had several like online conventions talking about voting stuff. So there's this real push. And the question is, how does that translate necessarily into the on the ground in terms of getting people out to vote? Now, I interviewed, several, Black men when I was in Kenosha. And I was actually a little bit surprised. I realized that, the system has been broken for so long for many Black people in this country. And that there is going to be that sense of disenchantment with the system. But the level of cynicism was a little bit higher than I thought it would be. There were some guys hanging out on in front of a house, and I was like talking. There was probably like a good 6, 7, 8 of them out there, and each of them were like, "No, I'm not voting." Like, I voted 4 years ago. One of the guys there, he actually was going out and picking up people 4 years ago to take them to the polls and all that. And he said, and Hillary still lost, and he had this sense that like it's rigged. He's like, I went out there, I took people to the polls, we got out, we voted, we did X, Y, Z, and it still turned out the way not the way that we wanted it to. And so that cynicism kind of remained, is like, what's actually going to happen? Like, is anything actually going to change? And believe it or not, I think people always make a big deal that Trump has said, he wouldn't come out right and say that he's going to like agree to a peaceful transition of power. I wonder if seeding that doubt also kind of seeds this doubt in the minds of some voters, because what I also heard from some of those voters, and I was actually talking to an activist in Joliet, Illinois this week, a Black activist, and he said he was hearing the same thing from people there, because he's doing a lot of activism on the ground there, is this sense among Black voters that like, even if Trump wins, he said a lot of them said they were going to vote, but he said probably about 7 out of 10 Black people he spoke to who were going to vote would then say after that, but I don't think Trump's going to leave office anyway. So there is like this perception, real or imagined out there, that there's going to be some sort of like civil war that we're hurtling toward, and that that could be affecting things. And the important thing I think for the Trump side is that he knows he's not going to win the Black vote outright, but like any support you can shave off, because we know the support that was shaved off in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin 4 years ago, that those were decisive in the election. So it's all about like, it's this game of inches, right? If he can shave off enough support. Now, I think that what I have heard from activists, though, is that the fear, I'm going back to that woman in Henderson County, the woman who first voted for JFK, talking about fear that she's never felt before. I talked to Martin Luther King III today, and he thought this was even more important than when his father was, back during the civil rights era. Then he thought this moment was even bigger for race relations than it was then, because he felt like back then they had, recourse with elected officials in Washington. So all that is to say, there's this level of fear and this level of resistance among activists that I think it's going to be interesting to see if that does outweigh the sense of cynicism that you get from some Black voters still who say this vote doesn't matter.
Right. And instead, you had a story just about recently, was it yesterday's paper online yesterday, about LeBron James teaming up with President Obama, right? I mean, there are concerns, right? That turnout they want to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what President Obama has done in the last week, it's pretty clearly targeted at Black turnout and specifically Black men. I mean, he's gone to Philadelphia. He was in Orlando. He's doing this thing with LeBron this week. I mean, they have pretty much laser focused him on doing that. I mean, I think that's for a couple reasons. I think that like they understand that the difference between good and great Black turnout is really the engagement of Black men. But I also think that we can sometimes fall, because the Trump administration has put so much energy in Black men. We're still, again, as John said, we're talking about margins here. I mean, Black men vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. It will be probably, even if Trump does well, that number will probably in the 70s or 80%. You know, that it is a group that can pick off some in important states. But when we are talking about the amount that the president seems to be bleeding among seniors, among suburban folks, among women, he is not going to make that up in Black men, right? That has to be part of a larger piece that he's able to do. But he is making a kind of show of it, right? And I think that we're doing a story on this week and have done a lot of work on that previously. I think you cannot overstate how Democrats' ability to win Black votes is not because Democrats have been uniquely good to Black people. It is because a baseline, a kind of asymmetric relationship with the community that, frankly, a lot of Black voters feel like the party has not adequately supported their communities, that they have taken their votes for granted and the like. It's just also coupled with the feeling that Republicans are opposed to their identity. And so that's not a real and true option. And so that's why you get a lot of the disaffectedness. That's why you get a lot of the cynicism. Frankly, I think the cynicism is warranted throughout the Black experience and history in this country. And so I think that those are the factors that go into it. But for as much as Trump's efforts on Black men, the kind of performative efforts that he's made this year, I mean, they said this in 18, they said this in 16, and we should remember in 2016, Black turnout certainly dropped, but it went back to the levels of 2004, basically. It went back to the point before there was Barack Obama on the ticket. And it's not as if Black people uniquely set out the election. It was part of a larger Democratic base that was not feeling enthused about the nominee. Every sign we have points that this year will be somewhat different.
And I want to remind everyone who's with us today to please take some time as you're listening, put any questions that you have for our great panelists here in the Q&A, because we're going to be getting to them soon, and Yvonne Laddie is waiting to get them all queued up. Caitlin, I wanted to talk a little bit about immigration. And what we saw at the debate last week, where Trump and Biden offered very, very different approaches in tone and substance. And I was wondering if you can talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's always interesting to be included in panels like this, because I spend most of my time with people who can't vote. But the fact that immigration, and not only that, but also that, as you've heard several times tonight already, immigration doesn't tend to be, the primary voting issue for almost any demographic group, but it's becoming a bigger deal. And I think that was evident in the final debate when immigration came up pretty substantively. And then you saw a conversation that echoed, this very widening chasm that we've been talking about, where right out of the gate, when asked about family separations, one of these things that, though not explicitly talked about during the 2016 campaign, I think that the notion of something like it would certainly fall into the category of things that Trump may have made big promises about in 2016, but, people thought maybe he wouldn't actually deliver on them, and lo and behold, he did. So he's asked about it during the debate, and immediately he stands his ground, and he begins to really sort of blame separated families essentially for being criminal and for basically sort of deserving what happened to them. And then Biden takes the opposite tack, and he actually has been pushed, I think, like a lot of liberal politicians, a lot of more moderate liberal, like law and order politicians, including his running mate, to the left on immigration, just in the short time between the primary debates between the Democratic candidates and where we are now. So he paints this opposite picture. Again, this welcoming, nature of the United States being part of our identity, something as a country that we want to expand, being welcoming and sort of welcoming the idea of, letting go of, is it letting go of a sort of a white dominance, or is it just, they're not terribly explicit yet, right? Like, we've gone through periods in this country where elected officials paint a picture of, a melting pot, and then we have like the salad bowl sometimes, and then, we have Trump who uses euphemisms that tend to reinforce starker dichotomies. So it'll be interesting to see where the country goes. But I think that immigration, though it is not usually the primary voting issue, It's interesting to see how it layers on top of all these others. It's part of a pattern. And two, I think that, you know, one of the challenges that we face as reporters is to cut through euphemisms, right? But in all of our, you know, when we're interviewing politicians and when we're interviewing voters, when they're talking sort of conceptually about, you know, wanting to make sure that their kids get good education and that too many resources aren't being pulled away, or when they're talking about, you know, the neighborhoods looking different than they did before, like really drilling down and trying to get people to articulate and help us understand like what exactly the concern is. I think that immigration is helpful, you know, in a way. What do I want to say? Like the things that have happened in the last 4 years help us crystallize as journalists how people are actually feeling, because it's not just abstract notions. There are specific things to point to. You know, family separation that took place is a specific thing. You know, kids who've drowned in the Rio Grande, you know, on their way into the US, those are specific things. You know, the conditions at detention centers that people are paying more attention to than they ever have before. There are specific things that have bubbled up, and they just are giving us, I think, a clearer picture now on where people stand when it comes to this broader evolution, and then push back against that evolution toward you know, toward being a country that is more brown and more Black, just, you know, in terms of hard numbers, but also culturally, versus not.
Yeah, and speaking about that, Sabrina, you wrote a piece about Kamala Harris and about you know, this wave of second generation immigrants, and you know, how it's becoming you know, she's a symbol of this kind of growing force. I'm wondering if you can talk about that and what we're seeing in that regard in terms of politics.
Yeah, I think that so Rachel's referring to a piece I wrote when Harris was first named running mate to Biden. Essentially, she's sort of exactly kind of a walking American second generation child. So, you know, the United States had you know, huge surge in immigration at the turn of the 20th century, 1890s to 1910s. There was this real kind of slamming the door in the 1920s, which, you know, we all remember. There's kind of coincided with not by accident, you know, the Jim Crow laws, a real kind of closing off and a sort of spasm of racial violence and in the country. It really wasn't until 1965 that that the country allowed immigrants, non-European immigrants, to start to come. And her parents were both beneficiaries of that, a father from Jamaica and mother from India. And so, you know, what you have in the United States today is a very large number of people who were born to those folks who came after 1965. They are powerful voting force. They are oftentimes not Black or white. They're usually, you know, there's a significant share that are Asian, either South Asian or East Asian. And of course, very, you know, the Hispanic population as well is now, I believe, close to basically kind of 17% of the population, I believe, of the United States. So, you know, this huge new group of people that a number of people in my story said, you know, they were coming of age as an Indian American in Virginia, in rural Virginia in the 1970s. And they just didn't really fit into either category. They didn't quite know how to understand themselves. No one knew how to understand them. You know, they were this sort of very unusual thing. And now, you know, more than 50% of the state of you know, minors in the state of California are children of immigrants, non-white. So, you know, it's just a huge change over the course of a generation of sort of, you know, what this country looks like, its demographics, and yeah.
Yeah. You know, we're getting a lot of questions in, so I'm going to ask one last one, and then we'll get to your questions. But I wanted to ask a bit of a more of a personal question. As you guys have discussed, we are living through a time when the country seems so divided politically and on these issues of race and ethnicity and immigration. And I'm wondering for the journalists of color on our panel, if you could talk a little bit about what it is like covering this moment right now. Estelle, you want to start?
Yeah, a light question.
I like light questions, yeah.
Uh, I think it can be all things at once. It can be impossibly difficult. It can be frustrating. It can be rewarding. It can be, all of those things. I mean, I like to think though, and I kind of take comfort in the very sad reality that, I'm not the first or the last Black journalist to feel like you're telling these stories in this moment where politics has a real stake, both for your communities that you know and have grown up in, and for your own identity. I mean, I think that we are part of a tradition of people of color in media and journalism who have pushed the boundaries of what is considered a fair and objective lens, who have pushed the voices that are included in our outlets, and have really pushed the country to kind of face itself in a way that it has long strained not to. And so in that view, I think I like to think that whatever I am feeling now and all that kind of complicated emotions around it are actually, part of a long tradition of people who have felt that. And it gives me, I think, a sense of like purpose to feel as if it's a real clarity in the kind of moral mission of it all. My father's a pastor, and sometimes it feels like similar energy where it's like you really believe in this thing and you want people to see it. And I think what I believe in, as we all do, is the values of kind of truth and fairness and the kind of journalistic ideals that we stand on. And so that's a really long and mushy answer to say it feels complicated.
Okay. Jenny?
Complicated seems right. I have the benefit, or I think I'll call it a benefit, of being ethnically ambiguous in my appearance. And often I find that people think I am whatever they are. So if I walk into a predominantly Latino group, they're going to rightly assume that I am one of them. But I also sort of get mistaken for being Armenian or someplace from the Middle East. And it helps me, frankly. It helps me kind of shapeshift in a way that I'm often accepted where I might not be if I were less ambiguous looking. So I sort of want to acknowledge that. I think I would echo everything Estelle just said about standing on shoulders of other people and sort of the moral clarity of our mission. I really went into journalism for very idealistic reasons and try to hold on to those all the time. And I think a lot about people who both came before me and really mentored me to do this kind of work. And I have to acknowledge, like, there's a loneliness factor, frankly. I'm one of very few Latino reporters, men or women, covering the national campaign. And it's strange sometimes to, like, you look around and like, who's going to understand what I'm feeling? And I turn to, frankly, to Black colleagues, I turn to women colleagues, I turn to alt-white colleagues, I turn to lots of people, but the loneliness factor is real. And I really am much more aware of trying to encourage more young Latino reporters to go into political journalism specifically.
Caitlin?
I would add to what my colleague said before that, when Rachel, you first told me about this question, the first thing that came into my mind was, what's it like better than before? Better than it was before. So I think that, the sense of purpose absolutely motivates me every day. The support that I get from people who've mentored me and people who, whose legacies I look up to gives me a sense of purpose and helps me keep going. And the loneliness factor is real as well. But what I've noticed just in the last 4 years of being at the Times and in the last 10 years of being in journalism, I mean, the newsrooms are like, it's a night and day difference. I mean, you used to be able to pick the people in the newsroom of color, there were less than, you could count on one hand. you would go to the NABJ convention and it would be like one writer, one editor, like one person from like the business side of things, because there were just so few people. I mean, I'm being a little hyperbolic here, but it was really hard to reach a critical mass of support. And it's getting a lot better, not just at the Times, but in many other places when it comes to Black journalists. And I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there to make it even better. And when it comes to Latino journalists and other, ethnic and racial minorities, like Jenny mentioned, it's still really bad, and it needs to get a lot better, because I can say that in my life, in my professional life, it's made such a huge difference for me to be able to call John Elgo, as I do all the time, when I want to talk about something, or call Rachel, or call Estelle, or call Jenny, or even, call Sabrina. Like, we all are here to support each other, but you got to have your people to be able to go to. And it just makes a really, really big difference. I've seen a world of difference in the 10 years that I've been doing it. And I think that, when you guys are ready to start working in newsrooms, I hope, because we're going to keep getting promoted and we're going to keep pushing for these changes even harder than, than others have before, that it'll be even better for you.
John?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, in this moment, the country's like clearly it's more divided than, if I would, like, I started working as a national correspondent in 2012. And so I definitely say the country feels more divided now than 8 years ago. But I feel like the calculation, being a Black person covering, this country, this political atmosphere, I don't think, for me at least, the calculation has changed that much. Like, I still, every time I go out in certain communities, I think depending on where I am, depends on where I'm going to put my hair up or I'm going to leave it down, right? I was doing a story in St. Louis and, with some Black folks in the community there, and I was hanging out with them, and he told me, make sure you keep your hair down. And I was driving around a white suburban Wisconsin the other day, going to people's houses to ask them questions. And so I made sure to pull my hair up and have my notebook in front of me and holding it like this, holding it up high, just where they can see my hands. These calculations have like played in all the time. And I think, the difference this time might be something, and I don't know, I mean, maybe like it's different for you, Sabrina, but like, I still feel like I'm getting the same hostility that any reporter, especially like New York Times reporter, would get at this moment when we are being framed as the enemy of the people and those types of things. So I got like in that Wisconsin town, there was a guy answered, or no, we're not going to say anything to the New York Times. I sent a message to someone in that town, and then they put my message on a Facebook group that they had, and I knew someone who was on the Facebook group, so they sent me screenshots of the responses, and the responses were all like, oh, the New York Times is coming here to make you look bad, and it's going to be a clarion call for BLM to come in and for Black Lives Matter to come into town. So yeah, I guess all that's a long way of saying, like, I feel like it's always been treacherous. I think we're just swept up in a greater divide now, but as a Black journalist, especially when covering the middle of the country, you always have to be calculating like which color you're going to be wearing today, which chameleon you're going to be like today, so you kind of have to adjust and shift and code switch and all that stuff. So,
and Sabrina, I know that you felt this divide too, just what John was talking about, right? In terms of being out there, you're a white reporter, obviously, but you're experiencing this divide in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, John, that's terrible about the Facebook post. I mean, yeah, there's just, on the part of people who are feeling this partisan thing really strongly, there's some serious hostility, and that is, and I mean, everybody on this panel has been talking about it in terms of people they're talking to. People are like thinking that, a lot of people think that something terrible, really terrible is about to happen. I mean, this woman I was interviewing in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, was like canning vegetables and like getting her sewing machine fixed and stuff like that. Like, she was like, oh yeah, like something's going to go down, and I better be able to like support myself for the next month or so. Having said that, I would just inject a little reminder that while it is true that we are incredibly divided, there is also a proportion of the American population that is not as partisan, that is not as, really hyped up on a kind of the divide and sort of taking part in that kind of team sport, I'm red and I'm blue and I hate the other side thing. I mean, I think there is, I mean, I spend a lot of time with non-college people who are not necessarily that political, and they, you know, it's not that it doesn't exist for them. It very much does. I mean, they feel like there's this black cloud that's right, you know, out. I mean, a year ago it was like, oh, it was out there in Washington and it's really unpleasant and we try to avoid it. And now it's like, oh my God, it's in my face, it's in my toothpaste. But I'm not, you know, I want to try to avoid it as much as I can. I mean, these are people who maybe are kind of, you know, non-confrontational as a personality type. They are not, you know, I mean, I feel like, you know, these people, I mean, you ask them to talk about politics. You know, it's like you're asking them to take their clothes off in public. You know, they're like, oh my God, politics with New York Times. And half the time, you know, for those that are really not that partisan, it's like, it doesn't really matter, you know, that I'm from the New York Times. I mean, you know, it's sort of like, well, I'm sure you're a very nice lady and probably, you know, you're honest, but I would rather have a root canal than have my name in the New York Times, you know, in any newspaper, because it's dangerous for my family. Potentially, people will attack me in my own community if I say something against the president, and I'm kind of, you know, and I'm in a community where everybody likes him. All my partisan people like him very much. Then it's going to be, I'm never going to hear the end of it. I could be, you know, it's just like. It's I just feel like the toxicity in the public space has risen to such an extent that a lot of people who aren't, you know, who are exiting it. And that is, you know, it's harder for journalism because you try to get people, you try to talk to people who aren't necessarily, you know, a hard right or hard left. And it's like, it's hard to get them to engage because they're terrified of being in the public space anymore.
Yeah. Well, we thank all of you for joining us in this public space, and we're going to get to your questions right now. Gwen Aviles has a good one. She says, thank you for being here and for your fantastic work. I read you all religiously. How do you navigate writing about Latinos when they comprise such a big group of people hailing from dozens of countries? How do you fight against the idea of the Latino vote? And can you talk a little bit about disinformation that has targeted communities of color? I think that Caitlin and Jenny can talk about this. Jenny just wrote a piece about disinformation though, and about efforts to kind of pit Latinos and Blacks against each other. But both of you, how do you write about Latinos as journalists in America?
Go ahead, Jenny. I feel like you're poised to take the first stab.
Can you hear us, Jenny?
I will first say that I do not have all the answers. Let me start.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Did my internet go out?
Yeah, you're kind of frozen, but we can hear you.
I will.
And now
we'll try again.
Okay, go ahead.
I will first say that I don't have all the answers. I think Ested alluded to this earlier in terms of Black voters, and I want to state the same. The numbers are, there is an overwhelming majority of Latino voters who vote Democratic. And in the primary, there was a number of Latino voters who preferred Bernie Sanders in most states. So there is like a notion of majority, and that is real. And it is also true that there's a huge amount of diversity within this Latinos. And I think my only solution to it, or my best attempt, is just to report and just to ask people questions and to be talking to lots of people all the time in different age groups and of different educations often shape the way people are thinking. And the only thing, what we know, and not understate what we know, just have the reporting to back it up. Really simple, but it's also sort of the most difficult thing to do.
Caitlin, did you want to weigh in?
Sure, yeah. So, I am lucky in that I'm not a straight political reporter, so I'm usually not writing anything that says, you know, by and large, this group is voting this way or the other. I'm really glad that I don't have to do that because I'm not good at analyzing polling. And I also hate to make those generalizations. I think that that's why, even though, you know, everything that my colleagues write is completely sound, I think that's why I gravitated in a different direction in terms of what I like to write about. And I like to focus more on kind of basically things that don't have a whole lot to do with voting. I think that, you know, disinformation has been a really big issue with immigration, just starting first and foremost with this like concept of asylum. So President Trump has managed to convince a lot of the country that requesting asylum is illegal, and it's not, and that it's completely legal. And that's just one example. There are so many others, but of how, you know, this issue that I cover has been completely warped in the public's mind. It's almost like requesting, you know, signing up for refugee resettlement, and going through that, you know, years-long process is considered like criminal or wrong, even though that's, you know, a program that the United States created because it wanted to welcome refugees in, or, you know, it was all about like anybody who going through that process was trying to lie and was a criminal and was trying to like come in and, you know, do terrorism in the United States, when, you know, the vetting that goes along with refugee resettlement is a years and years long process, and, you know, a background check that, you know, it would be hard for anybody to pass because it's so thorough. So I do feel like I do a whole lot of sort of fact checking when I'm out in the world, talking not necessarily to people who are on their way into the country, but when I'm talking to Americans about how they feel about immigration issues generally, when I'm writing about communities that have been upended or feel they've been upended with changes brought on by immigration. It's been interesting. I think that, you know, it's just makes it more important than ever that the stories we write are very specific, are very clear, don't play into stereotypes on one side of things or the other, because it's just so easy to lose people now and to lose their attention. But what does really catch people, I think, and make them think is when you can, you know, point out, you know, something like, you know, this idea that asylum, a lot of people think that it's illegal, but it's actually totally not. And, you know, here's the law, here's what it says. And, you know, if you come to the border and hand over your passport and ask for refugee status, that you're doing everything, you know, really along with the letter of the law. That really kind of surprises people. Like, obviously I can't do it for the entire country on my own. I'm one person, but I think that, you know, we've got really big platforms here. And I think that people are still open to that information, which I think is a good thing. And so it's just kind of raised the bar, just made it, you know, that much more important for us to do this kind of constant work of fact checking to make sure people understand the issues that we cover.
Okay, we've got Carolyn He who says, what do you make of Ice Cube meeting with Trump? Who wants to take it? No one's volunteering? John, Ested, come on.
What do I make of it? I make nothing of it. I mean, I think that there is an over-representation of particularly rich Black men who flirt with Trump politically, and I think that's wrapped up in a lot of reasons. I think Trump speaks a language of wealth that folks can identify with, of misogyny that people can identify with, of a nativist sentiment that some of this group identifies with. And so I don't think there's any surprise that a certain sect of reactionary Black men have somewhat gravitated to that. And so, you know, I think that on a kind of macro point, we don't see much evidence that celebrity endorsements really mean anything, frankly. So like, even if it wasn't Ice Cube and wasn't Trump, you know, that as a genre really hasn't had that much of a place here. And then even more so, we have not seen the litany of Black men celebrities who have, remember when Steve Harvey was going to the Trump Tower to negotiate, and when Kanye West was in the White House, and now you have Ice Cube. I mean, the history of a certain type of man thinking that they are going to business relationship to make a contract with Trump is one that is long and one that has shown no fruitful political meaning or policy meaning. So frankly, I think it's a lot of noise, and I think it is a attention-starved celebrity seeking some.
All right. Claire Nocturne wants to know, what has surprised you the most in your reporting this year? Any of you want to take that?
I want to take that and try to answer the other question about disinformation, because I think what has surprised me the most is how, and this is post-COVID from my perspective, how many people are buying into conspiracy theories that are floated out in disinformation campaigns, particularly, frankly, among voters of color, among Latino voters, among Spanish speakers. Just the number of people, ISIS in fact, has been really surprising, perhaps naively so, but has really surprised and worries me.
Okay. We've got a couple of people who are really concerned about what is coming after this election. Alicia Ortiz says there's collective fear here on the ground among our racials. And people wondering what's going to happen if Trump gets elected. Many are talking about a civil war. And she's wondering if you guys have heard that. Sabrina was talking about someone out there who was obviously feeling that. What's the anxiety level like? What are you guys feeling out there among voters on this? Don't be shy.
I'm still in Brooklyn, so I don't think that I don't think Park Slope is going to rise up, but I am curious what people in the other states have been hearing.
I'm in DC, so that's even worse. I guess I wanted to say something on this point, because it is obviously a question in everybody's minds. And certainly, lots of voters feel like something terrible is about to happen. I mean, I guess, there's so many pieces to it, and there've been tomes written about kind of how democracies die and how governments break down. I mean, I guess in my mind, and I'd be curious to hear what you guys think, I can imagine sort of a couple of Kenosha type things happening. So, protests, and then kind of, right-wing guys coming in, and some violence, and some people potentially maybe even getting killed. I guess I can't quite in my mind go to a place where there would be ongoing organized political violence, particularly with some participation by the state. And maybe that is just complete lack of information, lack of imagination on my part. But, the United States is so splintered and not centralized. I mean, just look at like healthcare policy and Medicaid, it's like every state has its own kind of way of doing things. And it just is hard for me to actually imagine that there's some kind of, rumbling kind of, 1937 moment right now. I mean, I could be completely wrong, and then I'll be ashamed of going back and seeing your recording, Rachel, of this panel. But I keep trying to kind of, my husband is used to be in political science grad student, and all of his old grad school friends they're all comparativists, and they think about Argentina, and they're all panicking, oh my God, the US is about to just fall off a cliff and it won't be a democracy anymore. And I say, like, I can't quite go there. But then they remind me that, the last time I said that was when Vladimir Putin took over in 2000. And I was also completely wrong about where that was going. So, who knows? I'm not good at calling these things.
I think one relationship that's kind of underrated in this current political moment is Trump's with his own base, and how much radicalization has happened there. right? And so that's not something that actually changes the course of the election. That's not going to mean someone who voted for him, who didn't vote for him, who not votes for him. And I don't think it has much of an electoral college impact, but I do think it has a big societal one when we think about what happens after election day. And so I certainly don't know about state involvement, and I also have a hard time thinking of like ways in which that happens. But I do think that there is a segment of the population, or I think back to this story I did at the end of last year, where I went to Trump stock. It was this collection of super fans of Trump who were pretty openly white nationalists. This was not like your regular old Trump voter. These were the hardcore, no immigrant should be here. There was open use of the N-word. I mean, it was very, very intense. And the amount of comfort with the idea that that even if a Democrat were to win, they would not be a legitimate member and partner in government was one. And then another one that they should be ready for violence was the second. And so I don't know if folks actually follow through on that. And so I guess besides the question of political violence, which I think we know can be a possibility, but some might seem far off, the question of how does our government work if a segment of the population do not think that it is valid, I think is going to be a very important one. And so that could be expressed through kind of like political violence and the like. That could just be expressed in a further breakdown of Washington, a further erosion of policy, a super imbalanced Supreme Court and Senate that that continues to splinter in opposite directions from where the popular vote and public opinion are. And if that doesn't get fixed, we have a breakdown in a totally other way. And so I think that, there's these kind of dual tracks that are happening right now. And, Jenny mentioned conspiracy. I think a big part of the kind of trust in government, when we hear, I talked to a bunch of QAnon folks today, and in that kind of way it's expressed is not just, oh, Democrats or pedophilia and all of that. It's just that they're not people who we have to deal with in government. That bureaucracy and the deep state are things that we can discard. I think that's going to have a huge effect on the way kind of society moves forward. And, for Joe Biden, who talks about bringing folks together and restoring the soul of a nation and all of that, that goes way deeper than Donald Trump. And it's an open question about whether, no matter who gets the most votes on Tuesday, whether those are goals that are even possible now.
That was actually a question I had for you. And someone else brought this question about Biden. I've been thinking about that too, just about, his narrative about decency and about being the man, not for just blue states, but for red states, about bringing a country together. Does that resonate? Are those our ideals now? I don't know. It seems like we'll be wrestling with those questions as we go. And wait, I just want to make sure here. Okay, so the question about Biden with this is that, do you think Joe Biden is a candidate of the moment in the same way that Trump or Obama was a candidate of their moment? Why him now and not before? Especially given the diverse list of candidates in the primary.
I mean, it feels to me like if the moments for at least people who don't like Trump or if the moment is a stopgap or some sort of like bulwark against Trump, then I think that's why Biden won the Democratic nomination, right? There were like that viewer said that there were many diverse candidates. There were many brilliant candidates in the Democratic field, but were people willing to try another woman? Were they willing to try a person of color? As the Democratic nominee, there was such this fear that like we need that stale white man to like go up against Trump. That that I think that. So Biden might be the man for that moment, and we'll find out again if he wins the election, right? But even with the talk of like, is he only actually going to serve one term? I mean, clearly this is not like a moment like when Barack Obama won and was like making a statement for the country, right? And and then the one question that I kind of had, hearing Ested and some of my colleagues speak is like, what does Trumpism then become if Trump loses, right? Is it still here to stay? I think that's one of the questions that I think we're going to be examining. Like, if Trump loses after this election, like, is that underlying Trumpism still here, or is it still just such a niche thing that, like, I mean, that it really has no bearing or no real influence in American life? going forward. I don't know, but I kind of throw that out there.
Yeah. I want to take one that's totally different from what we've discussed so far. Someone's got a question about climate change, a huge issue that hasn't been talked about as much as this participant would have hoped. And this participant, who's anonymous, saying that is there intersectionality between race and climate change in this election?
I think there is, and I think there will continue to be. I mean, the thing about climate change is it's never talked about enough, but it's also one of those things that it actually has real implications, and so you can't ignore it. But you're either talking, the New York Times Magazine just did a huge series. They're in the middle of a huge series about how climate change has been a major factor that led to, more than 2 million people tried to cross the border into the United States from Central America alone between 2017 and 2019. And those numbers are expected to be, exceeded by orders of magnitude if climate change continues at pace. So definitely, I think with regard to immigration, climate change is a really important factor, even if we're not talking about it specifically and directly. At a certain point, I think we'll have to, but the implications of it, we're certainly grappling with. And then similarly, I'm not as much of an expert. I'm not really an expert at all on this. I would be curious what Jenny thinks as somebody who used to cover California. But again, with the implications and the impacts of climate change, those things become political issues, even if the candidates aren't talking about them, so talking about climate change kind of on its face.
Right, and actually I'm gonna stop us here on climate change because Ested is gonna have to bow out, and I wanna ask one last round of questions for you and make sure that I get to him before he has to jump. You guys are here at NYU, and I was hoping that you could talk at the Journalism Institute. If you could talk a little to students now, and the media industry is changing dramatically. It's kind of moving under our feet. What advice would you give to young people who are studying journalism right now and really want to report on these issues? And instead, you go first, because I know you have to run.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. I mean, I think that this is always a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think I both want to be, give the advice and clear-eyed, and also be honest that it is a hard industry that comes with like legitimate press and challenges, and that some of that, ride isn't straight. And so I guess though the type of biggest things I would think about, I'm fairly sure. Yeah, I'm the youngest person here. I graduated college in 2015, right? Like I was thinking actually today how I watched Ted Cruz announce for the last presidential election in my college library because I had broken my laptop. And I was thinking just how crazy like the last 4 or 5 years have been. And I think a part of that I say to say that like I remember being at that time, and the one reason I didn't like journalism in college, even though it was my major, just because it had the least amount of requirements, I like felt like it didn't feel it felt so contained in that collegiate bubble, and I didn't like it, right? All the newspaper kids I didn't really like. It felt very like stale and like stuck in school. And one thing I loved once I actually got a journalism internship that was outside of school was how tangible it felt, and how that level of impact and talking to people can be something that you bring. And so I guess my large scale of advice would only be that, to the extent that you can break out of what is a kind of tight bubble of school is an important one. And that the experiences I think back about having, serving my journalism life the best were not the times that I had tried, or had gotten, not the writing practice or even that, even though that is very important, but was having a diversity of experiences where I felt like, particularly as a person of color, that I could go into the Trump rallies, that I could go into Black places and do the work that was necessary. And I think that if you bring that level of intention and clarity to your reporting, that you can grow on the kind of practice of journalism. So, if you read and write and listen to folks who are better at it than you, like you can get better at that thing. I think that what the thing that sometimes I feel like is the thing that I would be most concerned about is making sure that you have a lens and a perspective that is informed through your reporting, but that you feel comfortable in owning, and you're having the necessary experience. You're talking to a diversity of sources to really check you on that. And I would say also to just know what you don't know. I mean, I think that a big help for me over the last few years has been like being fairly blatant in reaching out to people whose work I really liked, or who I read a story and would think, how did they do that? And then like just ask them and really try to learn from others. And I think even, in covering a presidential campaign for the first time, there's been lots of folks who have done this before who have helped me think about it and who I have learned from. And I think when you couple that with the lens and experience that you have, like the combination of those things can be a good one. And so that was, again, like, I don't think that's a clear advice. I guess my third piece of advice would be to know yourself and disregard most advice. And so, like, I think the combination of those things would be my spiel. But thank you. I appreciate you having me, and sorry I have to run.
No, thank you for joining us. All right. Any other advice?
I'll jump in. Advice to journalists. I think, yes, reaching out to others and being bold about talking to reporters who you admire about how they do their work is such a big part. It's kind of all of our like dirty little secret. And I feel like each of us have probably talked to each other in this panel about a story in the past and just said like, how did you do that? And even if you're not reaching out directly, just constantly being like a student of journalism can be one of the.
Caitlin, I'm going to stop you for a second because our other political correspondent has to leave also.
Oh, got it.
Jenny,
Okay.
Sorry, I just 2 minutes, Jenny, whatever you got.
No, I'm gonna listen to Caitlin's answer and then I'll jump in.
Okay. All
Caitlin,
right.
keep going.
Oh, I can't remember.
wait.
No. It's okay. It's okay, Jenny.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay, Jenny. Don't worry about it. No. I was just going to say read a lot and study people's work that you really admire, and you learn a ton that way.
I think I would say do this if you think it's the thing that you want to do, just do it. Just figure out a way of doing it. Find a way to write. Whether I always tell people, try your absolute best not to write and report without getting paid for it. I never could have afforded to take an unpaid internship, and I really encourage you, even if you can afford to take an unpaid internship, don't. You should get paid for your work, and I think that is fair for it. It levels the playing field for everybody. Echo all the things that Caitlin and Ested said in terms of asking people for advice. I've been doing this for more than 15 years, and I still call Sabrina and many other people, and I'm like, what the heck do I do? And I'm really unapologetic about that. Caitlin said read and just be passionate and just really believe in the work. I think this work is really important. I think this time has showed us how important that this work really is, and be willing to try new things. One thing Caitlin said earlier that I smiled about is about not wanting to be a politics reporter for different kinds of reasons. I resisted politics for about 15 years. And this year there was no resisting. I wasn't exactly given a choice. And there are ways to do things that really make it your own and that make it fun. I've been really surprised, frankly, how fun this job has been, the pandemic aside. And with that, I'm going to hop off to go to my campaign event that I'm responsible for. But thank you guys so much. It was really inspiring to hear from all of you.
Hi, Jenny.
All right. So John and Sabrina, really fast.
Yeah, I would say the main thing, just try your best to get the experience that you can. And I know it's difficult. Like I was fortunate to come up at a time when newspapers were still, doing internships, and then I got summer internships every summer. And I was blessed to have a family that, could support me living, could afford an apartment for me over the summer in Minneapolis or other places. So I think as an industry, we need to do better for people who can't afford those things to make sure that they get those opportunities. So we need to do that. And then the most important thing I'd say is be dedicated to like the craft and becoming like a really excellent reporter, because I think especially in this era, it's easy to get blinded by the social media accolades and all these, people like, it seems like everyone wants to be a social media star and a voice today. But the reason that Ested has a bunch of Twitter followers, the reason Caitlin has a bunch of Twitter followers is because they're really good reporters. Like, yeah, there's lots of people who can say witty things, but like there's few people who could report like the two of them do. And so that's what's going to get you somewhere. That's what gets, Nicole Hannah-Jones, like all these deals with TV and books and things like that, is because she can report the hell out of a story. So work on your craft, use every opportunity you can to report and really understand the fundamentals of the business. And that's, to me, that's the key to being a good journalist and to breaking into the profession.
Sabrina?
Yeah, I had a very strange way into journalism. I went to Russia in my early 20s and started journalism probably in my very early 30s. So I came to journalism through being abroad. And I just kind of went, and in those days you could with an American passport, and it was very cheap to live. And I did that for a number of years, and found journalism along the way. So I don't even know if people do that these days. Certainly not in Russia, but but that's also a way. It's just you have an interest in something else, and then writing and sort of chronicling what is going on in the place is the thing that feels most inviting. I also had nearly took a job at a bank for a while, so I was kind of all over the place. I wasn't necessarily a writer or a journalist from birth at all. I came to it late.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, those on the screen and those who had to run. And I want to thank all of you for joining this conversation. And I know that we will be thinking a lot about all of this over the next week, and depending on what comes after, well, no matter what comes after. So thank you all, and we'll be recording this and sharing it. It was great hanging out with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks a lot.